Thank you, Daryl, and thank you, Beacon College, for inviting me, because if there's one thing I love to do, it's talk about haunted Florida. So we're going to do that tonight. We're going to talk about the history of all the haunted places in Florida. Not all, but mostly on the northeast side, where Bob and I researched our books. And it's a good time for me to mention that I am half of a photojournalist team with my husband, Bob. He takes the pictures, I take a few, and I write the books. So this has worked out very well for us. We've spent a lot of time on the northeast coast and different other places. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about why Florida is such a hot spot for haunted history. Florida was the Wild West in the 18th and 19th century. There were gunfights, there were wars, there were Indian raids, and there was a lot of illness too. A lot of yellow fever outbreaks. No one knew in those days that mosquitoes were the cause of yellow fever. They used to burn tar and have big bonfires thinking that would get rid of the disease, but it was mosquitoes, and that wasn't discovered until Walter Reed did it. And sorry. And so there was a lot of death in early Florida, and with the death came the ghost stories. And what you see on the screen is the city gate of St. Augustine. The historians like us to say gate, not gates, because it was one wooden gate at one time. And it was part of the Cubo line of defense. In St. Augustine. They were attacked a lot by Indians, and it was a Spanish colony, and they were attacked by the British and French and so forth. And so during the yellow fever epidemic of 1821, a father left his daughter's body at the city gate because he could not afford to bury her. And to this day, people say late at night they see a little girl in white waving from the city gate, and some have even called the police because they want to know what a little girl is doing out so late at night. So let's see if this will work. Yay! All right, these are the two books that Bob and I wrote about haunted Florida. And haunted St. Augustine and St. Johns County obviously concerns St. Augustine, and Women in White concerns Duval, Nassau, Flagler, Clay, and Baker counties. Originally, my editor wanted me to do one book, but when I turned it in, she thought it would be better if it was more regional, so we split it into two books. Now, I don't like to say paranormal when I'm talking about ghosts in Florida, because para indicates something outside of the natural laws, kind of like driving on I-95. So Bob and I call ourselves ghost agnostics. We don't exactly believe in ghosts, but we've had a few really weird experiences, which I'm going to talk about in a little while and during our talk. And we talked to a lot of people who had very heartfelt, honest experiences with the supernatural. So I'd like to take a minute to just read a little bit of this book, Woman in White, and explains our philosophy of ghost lore. Bob and I didn't research the paranormal history of Northeast Florida. We researched its history, and the paranormal is as much a part of its past as the yellowed clippings from the Times-Union. Ghost stories have been labeled for far too long as beneath the intellectual integrity of proven history. Nothing could be further from the truth. Ghosts are a metaphor for memory. Narrative is the way people understand their world. Combine the two, and the reality of the past becomes transparent, albeit intangible. Although Bob and I have never seen a ghost, although we are not sure there are ghosts, we call ourselves ghost agnostics. We have experienced a few irregularities during our visits to haunted historic sites for which there is no ready explanation. Actually, there were 3 incidents. The first unexplained event occurred at the Book Loft, which is located in the historic district of Fernandina Beach in Nassau County. Bob was taking a picture, and out of nowhere, a glowing orb of light appeared. He snapped the picture, looked again, and it was gone. And that's a site I'm going to be talking about a little later. The second unexplained event occurred at the New Berlin Cemetery in Duval County. The day before our visit, I had spent some time at a museum, and I met Lester A. Hardy, grandson of former Governor Napoleon Bonaparte Broward. Lester spent some time telling me about the former statesman, including the fact that his first wife died within a year or 2 of their marriage. The following day, I stumbled across an old cemetery across the street from Yellow Bluff Fort. The first gravestone I laid eyes on in the New Berlin Cemetery marked the final resting place of the departed Mrs. Broward and her infant son, Napoleon Bonaparte Broward III. You can read, I'll be talking about that too. And the last event occurred at the Clay County Jail in Green Cove Springs. The docent gave us a tour of the deserted jail leading up to the rusty steps of the corridor where the most violent prisoners were kept. As I followed her down the walkway, I heard a strange sound, and I'll explain what it is when we get to that part of the lecture. So as an English teacher, I have to let the Romantic poets weigh in on how we remember the past. And the question is not, are ghosts real, but why do people believe in ghosts? There is a very specific place for ghosts in the telling of history. And I want you to listen to this poem by Percy Shelley, one of the Romantic poets, to see how he links the past, memory, and ghost lore. The poem is called Ozymandias. I met a stranger in an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Nearby, half buried in the sand, a shattered visage lies, whose wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that the sculptor well these passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of the colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." And of course, Shelley was referring to the sands of time, which is very much the venue of ghost lore. The first ghost stories I'm going to talk about are from the Women in White book. And you may ask, why Women in White? Don't confuse it with the book by Wilkie Collins. That was Woman in White. And I picked Woman in White as the title because these translucent ladies are acknowledged as spectral figures in Asia, Africa, Antarctica, Europe, North and South America, Australia. It's amazing, going back millennial, we have these stories of women in white. In fact, Bob, if you'd click it again. Lindsay Lohan is part of the popular culture, dressed up as a dead bride in the movie Mean Girls. So I wanted to tell you a couple stories I'd heard about women in white. In Pennsylvania, there's a ghost in a white cape who jumps on the hoods of cars when people go through the forest. And in Ireland, there's a very old story of the White Lady of Kinsale Castle. Apparently what happened was a soldier guarding the castle married a woman. She wore the white bridal gown and spent the night with her. And when he got back to his post, his fellow officers shot him for leaving his post. Well, his bride was so despondent, she leaped over the ramparts in her white dress and died. And to this day, people say they still see the White Lady of Kinsale wandering around the castle. Women in white are a universal ghostly figure. You can stay right there. Okay, this is the Kingsley Plantation on Fort George Island in Duval County. And the Gail Woodsworth, the volunteer who works there, told me that she saw a woman in white standing by the water, and I'm guessing it was probably Anna Kingsley, a Senegal princess who was kidnapped when she was 13 years old, enslaved, and put up for sale. Zephaniah Kingsley bought her and married her in a native ceremony. And they had 4 children together who ran the plantation for the next, for generations. And Zephaniah was away a lot because he was in the slave trade, unfortunately. And so Anna ran the plantation. She had slaves as well, oddly enough, and they grew sea cotton and sold it and made the dye indigo. You want to hit it again? The slaves who lived on the plantation, their homes are still there. They're made out of tabby, which is a mixture of oyster shells, water, and ash. And it's a very interesting place. University of Florida discovered the graves of 6 former slaves on the plantation. Okay, near Neptune Beach, we have the Homestead Restaurant. And I don't think it's the Homestead Restaurant anymore. I think it was a Mexican place and it's probably something else now. But it's still haunted, from what I hear. And the former owner, it's haunted by the former owner and patroness, Alpha A. Painter. And the restaurant was famous for fried chicken. She would go through 4,000 pounds of fried chicken in 1 week. And she kind of kept it up after her death, appearing at the top of the stairs, in mirrors, in flames in the stone fireplace on the ground floor. And some people say they see her in the woods behind the restaurant struggling to get out of her grave. But, you know, these are stories we've been told. This is the Casa Marina in Jacksonville Beach. This is a Spanish Mediterranean revival architecture. And it's about 123 years old. And Fatty Arbuckle, Charlie Chaplin, Oliver Hardy, Jean Harlow, all stayed there. Al Capone brought them Prohibition liquor. And at one time, Jacksonville Beach was known as East Hollywood. My phone's hooked up to sorry. So it was known as East Hollywood. And people could see silent film stars walking on the beach. But the townspeople didn't really like the movie stars. They disrupted them during church. There were chase scenes. They didn't like it. So they kind of iced the Hollywood crowd out of the picture. And the last silent film made in Jacksonville Beach was The Flying Ace in the 1920s. However, the ghost story has to do with room 206 in the hotel, which is haunted. Every hotel, if you ask if it's of any age, has a haunted room. And in this one, and this is a story they told me, a couple got married. They were spending their honeymoon at the hotel in room 206. And in the middle of the night, the husband noticed his wife was missing. So he got up and looked around the hotel, and the doors were all open because there was no air conditioning, and he found his wife with another man. Well, he went back to the room and hung himself, and when his wife returned and found him there, she went running down that hall and threw herself over the balcony. And people say they can still hear her running down the hall. However, if you look at the hotel, it's only 2 stories, so she must have landed on her head, or someone was embellishing a little bit. Okay, the book loft. This is where Bob saw the orb of light. If you look on the right, you can see it. And the people who work there say they have often seen it as well. This is a really great bookstore on Center Street in Fernandina Beach. It's on the National Register of Historic Places, and it's a brick 2-story building. It used to be yellow. I think they painted it blue. And it specializes in Florida authors and signed copies. And the owner has told, there's a 2nd floor, and the owner has told me that she'll leave for work. This doesn't happen all the time, but it happens occasionally. She'll leave for work, and the books are all neat and tidy on the shelves. And when she returns, they're stacked 5 feet high. And she seemed pretty reputable. So this is also the book loft. This is a picture that the owner found in a back room. The book loft at one time was also a gift shop and a hat shop. And this little girl is dressed in white, of course, and she has a lace collar and probably a St. Francis medal, which people wore in those days, or maybe even now. And people say customers say they have seen her among the stacks. Can you disable? Okay. This is the story of Kate Bailey and her house on Ash Street in Fernandina Beach. And on the left, you see a huge oak tree. And one day, Kate Bailey was sitting on her porch, and a bunch of men came by and started measuring the tree. And she said, "What are you doing?" And they said, "Well, you're in luck, Miss Bailey. We're going to cut this tree down and put a streetcar right down the street." And in those days, only the wealthy had streetcars, running by their homes. So they came back the next day with their saws and their picks and their axes. And Kate Bailey was sitting in front of the tree with a shotgun in her lap. So they went back to their boss and they said, "Look, Kate Bailey has a gun, and I think she'll shoot us if we try to take the tree down." So the tree is still there. The house on the right is the Bailey house. It has 11 rooms and 9.5 bathrooms and a carousel on the front porch. It's on the National Register of Historic Places, and it used to be owned by the Sheffields, who owned the Palace Saloon on Center Street. Okay, we do have a few women in black. And the first one is at the St. Luke's Hospital on Palmetto Avenue in Jacksonville, which was built in 1878. In 1888, they had a horrible yellow fever epidemic in Jacksonville. And they say even Clara Barton nursed in this hospital because she would go wherever she was needed as the founder of the Red Cross and a nurse. The story has to do with the Florida Casket Company, a brick building in the parking lot that was connected to the hospital with a chute. And the chute would shoot caskets into the hospital room when a person died. Well, this one time they got there a little too quickly and the lady was still alive. And now she haunts the hospital. She's dressed in black, crying and wringing her hands because the casket arrived before she took her last breath. The second story has to do with a house on 10th Street in Fernandina Beach. The great-grandson of Thomas Jefferson lived there, and he was also named Thomas Jefferson, but people called him TJ. He was a surveyor and an architect, and he traveled a lot on business. He was married to a woman named Celeste, who was kind of an extrovert and kind of a firecracker, and she missed him when he was gone. So one time when he came back, she told him that a man had made a pass at her. Well, TJ confronted the man and shot him. And at the trial, Celeste admitted she made it up to make her husband jealous. So what happened was she developed a white streak in her hair, and it said that anyone who lives in that house develops a white streak in their hair. That's what I've heard. The nuns in black at the Salon house came from France. They came from France to teach the children of former slaves how to read and write. And they taught in the church, and they slept on the floor. Well, the Bishop Verreau showed up, and he said that won't do, so he bought him this house. And in 1877, a yellow fever epidemic hit Fernandina Beach. And the nuns took people into their house. There were beds everywhere, and they nursed them. But they put the legs of the beds in basins of water because they did not, to keep bugs from crawling up the beds. But they didn't know that yellow fever was caused by mosquitoes in standing water, so it wasn't that great. The townspeople were really afraid to even go near that house. They would throw food and supplies on the porch, and 2 of the nuns died. Initially, they were buried in the yard. They moved them later to the Boscobello Cemetery, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the person who lives there now, the house has been restored and it's privately owned, says she sees the nuns all the time. One of the nuns was very short, apparently, so that's how she recognized her. She said she sees them in a rocking chair. She said every year they throw the Christmas lights on the lawn and pictures fly off the walls. And she says, well, it's just the nuns, I'm used to it. Another lady in black is Princess Scherbatoff of Princess Place Preserve. She was Princess Place Preserve, in case you don't know, is 15 acres of pristine woodland. At one time it was used to make turpentine, but it's totally a place for scouts now who like to camp out. And she and her husband, who she met when she was a hotel maid, she struck it rich, lived in this hunting cabin, and she put him in a boat. He got bit by a rattlesnake, and she put him in a boat to try to get him to the mainland, but he died before he got there. So she remarried a Russian prince on the run from the Bolsheviks, and she adopted his name and title. And Gail, one of the former county clerks talked to me and said, well, you know, she was very nice. She gave us books. And she said, but, you know, the closet, every time I tried to walk up the ladder to the loft, someone would push me off the third step. Now, she was a pretty credible person, and she said the same thing happened to her sister. Princess Scherbatoff loved to travel. She loved to shop. The loft was full of unopened cartons and barrels of international goods, but I don't think the county clerk ever got to see them. Fort Clinch is a seacoast fortification in Nassau County, and it goes back to the 18th century. It's named after General Clinch, who never fought a war there. He did fight in the Seminole Indian Wars, but he never did it from the fort. In fact, Fort Clinch has never seen any warfare. It was a Confederate stronghold until the Union took it over, but no soldier died of gunfire or any type of war injury there, but they did die of dysentery and malnutrition. Now, the fort is a very entertaining place if you ever go. It's very well preserved. It has tunnels and fences and brick walls and reenactors. And so the ghost story is that one day the volunteer in a July full moon saw 4 guys in Civil War garb climb out of the tunnel and over the fence. And the next year, he went back during the full moon to see if they would come back. This time, there were only 3. And he said, where's the 4th guy? And they answered, well, he's sick, couldn't come tonight. Boscabella Cemetery is really old and scary. It has resurrection fern and live oak trees, and if you stand on a hill, you can see the Amelia River. It's on Amelia Island, and Revolutionary War soldiers are buried there. A lighthouse keeper, mercenaries, and priests are buried side by side, and the ghost story has to do with a pirate named Louis Ory, who in 1818 had control of Fernandina Beach. Fernandina Beach has such a weird history, but a pirate really did run it for like 8 months. Well, they ran him out, but he left something behind, and that was his son, Luke Ory. The townspeople hated Luke. They were itching to hang him. He assaulted women, he beat people up, he was a thief, and finally they got the goods on him, and they put him in jail in the Amelia, which is now the Amelia Island Museum of History Museum. They put him in jail. They're going to hang him in the morning. But Luke didn't want to hang, so he cut his own throat. Well, he didn't die. So the doctor sewed him up. And at the appointed time, they marched him out to the gallows, well, actually to that oak tree you see in the picture, and they hung him. And when they did, his head separated from his body. And people were running around screaming and crying. It was just a riot. And people say, they probably buried him in the cemetery in an unmarked grave, but people say that the wind moans in the trees, makes a moaning sound when it goes through the trees ever since that happened. This is the old schoolhouse in Fernandina Beach. It's on Center Street. It's a 2-story brick building built in the late 19th century, and it was the Fernandina High School until 1924. And the roof developed a leak, and in order to fix a leak, it has to be raining. So the principal ordered a maintenance man to come look at it one night when it was raining. So he climbed up on the scaffolding and fell, mortally wounded. He crawled over to the window and banged on it. No one came. He died, and they discovered his body the next day. And they say that whenever it rains, bloody handprints appear on the windows. They wash them off, but they keep coming back. They say. Yellow Bluff Fort is in the small suburb of New Berlin in Duval County, and neighbors complain that ghosts go back and forth from the cemetery across the street to Yellow Bluff Fort. And first, the Confederates had were encamped there, and then the Union was encamped there. And for years, both sides, dug trenches and built barricades. However, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry camped there, and if you've ever seen the film Glory with Matthew Broderick, you know who they are. Now this is the fort, this is the cemetery across the street from Yellow Bluff Fort that the ghosts go back and forth to. And this goes back to the story I read you at the beginning, because when Bob and I walked into the cemetery, the first headstone that we saw was Georgie Caroline Broward, and her in the grave of her infant son, the former wife of Napoleon Bonaparte Broward. Now, Napoleon Bonaparte Broward went on to marry again. He had 9 daughters. So the son he had with Georgie was the only son he ever had. And I had to call up his great-grandson when I found her grave and tell him that Georgie had found me. Franklintown Cemetery off of A1A on Amelia Island is located in a gated community called Plantation Point. And Franklintown was the home of the freed slaves of the Harrison plantation, who let them have perpetual use, but unfortunately didn't put anything in writing. So the land was kind of sold out from under them, and the Harrison plantation was no more, so no one could do anything about that. The residents of Franklintown were moved to American Beach, but the cemetery stayed because it's a third-degree felony to move a cemetery. So Joe Green, a descendant of the people buried there, tends the cemetery, the 2-acre fenced-in area, and a lot of his relatives, most of the people buried there were related. The gravestone you see is Lena Hopkins, an ancestor of his. And the ghost story has to do with the children who lived on the plantation, and there's a long screed about a voice in the woods continuously calling them to come out. And their mother, their family would forbid them to go, but they were just drawn to it. And finally, I think their grandfathers, told them some incantation, and they never heard the voice again. This is a happier story. This is about American Beach on Amelia Island. Everyone from Franklintown moved here, and it was a really lively place at one time. There were juke joints where Etta James and Ray Charles performed, but it was also the home of Nana, the biggest sand dune in Florida. And a woman named Vinnie Besh, also known as the Beach Lady, is instrumental in making sure that Nana is still there. It's also like a National Historic Site, thanks to her. She went on CNN, she went on all the national news programs, and she, you know, got support, and the developers backed off, and she saved the 9 acres of beach and Nana on American Beach. Now, the ghost story has to do with the beach lady who swears she will come back to haunt any developer who appropriates 1 inch of sand. This is the old jailhouse in Clay County in Green Cove Springs. It was the home of murderers, moonshiners, and desperate men. It was also where they would house mental patients on their way to the asylum. So it was a really terrible place. A sheriff was killed downstairs. There was a gallows in the parking lot where they hung people. And it was a working jail until 1972. So the papier-mâché prisoners, though, are from the St. Johns County Jail. They loaned them or gave them to the Green Cove Springs. But the ghost story has to do with a tour Bob and I took, which I mentioned earlier. The picture on the right is where they kept the most violent prisoners. And the docent was telling us that doors open and shut, she gets locked out. They kept a ghost cam on and they saw wispy figures in the ghost cam. And my smart pen turned on. If you don't know what that is, it's a pen, I don't even know if they sell them anymore, but you could take notes and you could hear what the people were saying while you were taking notes. Well, I didn't have it on. And so it just turned on by itself. And that's the only time that ever happened. It was kind of weird. Voices came out of nowhere. This is the Olustee battlefield, the site of the Battle of Ocean Pond on February 20th, 1864. And Baker County celebrates this every year. They have a huge festival. And reenactors and food and all this stuff. And the ghost story has to do with 2 soldiers, Civil War soldiers, who were in the battle, who were enemies. And one of the soldiers shot the other one and just said he died in battle. Well, that would have been okay for him, except that the murdered soldier started appearing in his dreams. And he swore he was being haunted. So he actually confessed and was court-martialed and hung. But people camp out in the battlefield and they say they can hear, and this is around the time of the actual battle, they say they can hear the snorting of horses and the low murmur of men about to go into battle. This is the Florida Theater in Jacksonville. It takes up a whole city block, just as it did when it was built in 1936. And the films of Laurel and Hardy, Fatty Arbuckle, Tom Mix were all shown there. And they still have concerts there, really good ones. But this is also the site of Elvis Presley's first appearance in Florida in 1956. So people say they see a guy in the upper balcony smoking, and then he disappears. And the lights go on and off, and some people say that Elvis never really has left the building. This is the second book we're going to talk about, and this concerns mostly St. Augustine and St. Johns County. We wrote this book in 2013. Spent a lot of time in St. Augustine, and I just wanted to give you a little bit of the history about the ownership of the colony of St. Augustine. It was discovered in 1565 by Pedro Menendez after he dispatched all the French Huguenots, And it was a Spanish colony until 1763, when, because of the Treaty of Paris, the English took over, the British took over. And they hung on to St. Augustine for about 20 years. They changed the name of the Castillo De San Marcos to Fort Marion. And then in 1783, the United States got it. No, Spain got it again, because the British didn't even want it anymore. And so the Spanish held it until 1821, when it became a territory of the US. And then St. Augustine was actually the capital of Florida until 1845, when it became a state, and then the capital was moved to Tallahassee. But St. Augustine is a really rare mixture of an American city with Spanish, British, Minorcan, and American culture. And this is the famous Castillo De San Marcos. It was built by slaves and Indians. They started in 1673, I think, and they were done by 1693. And it was a really tough chore, because it was built of coquina, because coquina is indigenous to St. Augustine. There were quarries you can still see if you go to St. Augustine. They would dig the coquina out. It was made of little shells, compressed, and cut it into blocks, put it in a wheelbarrow, and take it to St. Augustine by canoe or barge. And it took them 20 years, and it was backbreaking labor. So the fort, there are many ghost stories about the fort. Chief Osceola was held there for a while. And even though he died in Fort Moultrie in South Carolina, visitors swear you can see his suffering visage on the west side of the fort. And cannons used to go off every day in St. Augustine at 6 o'clock. People used to time everything by it. They timed murder events by it, so they would know what time it was. And they don't do that anymore. But on the weekends, the cannons go off from 11:30 to 3:30 every hour, and reenactors fire them off. So one of the reenactors told me that one day, as he was firing the cannon, he turned around and he saw a reenactor he'd never seen before. And when after the cannon went off, he turned back, the guy was gone. And this seems to happen a lot in St. Augustine, because I have talked to numerous people who say they see a soldier by the gate or someone in period dress on St. George Street, and when they look again, the apparition is gone. This is Fort Matanza, also in St. Johns County. It's near Crescent Beach. And the only way to get to it is a ferry, which runs from Tuesday through Sunday every day. It was built in 1742 to replace wooden watchtowers, and it kind of fell into disrepair. They wanted a southerly lookout, for invaders, but it fell into disrepair. And at that time, Andrew Jackson was the governor, and he wouldn't fix it. He tried to sell it. The walls were cracked, the watchtower fell into the drink, and it wasn't until the 1920s that they actually did any repairs. But it defended Spanish St. Augustine from European attacks, and of course, it is near the site of the famous Matanzas massacre. Pedro Menendez was under orders from Charles II to take over St. Augustine, to make it a Spanish colony. The French Huguenots already had a stake. They had a fort called Fort Caroline with 300 people living in it. Well, Pedro Menendez murdered every man, woman, and child. and then went after the soldiers who had gone out on a ship to fight Menendez, but they got caught in a hurricane. So they were shipwrecked. And the Spanish conquistadors took them behind a sand dune almost one by one. There's a painting at the fort about it, and killed them. That includes General Jean Ribault as well. So now they say you see figures at night, flickers of light, shadows with no substance behind them. This is the famous Leitner Museum in St. Augustine, in historic downtown St. Augustine. Otto Leitner was a collector. He had a magazine called Hobbies, and he bought Flagler's Alcazar Hotel, which had been empty for probably 13 years. It was just used as a warehouse. He bought it to store his collection of Gilded Age artifacts. He had 40,000 pieces, and I think they're still there. And he bought it in 1947, and the townspeople weren't too thrilled about that because it generated no revenue, there were no taxes. But then Otto Leitner died after a horrible car crash, and he's actually buried on the grounds. That's his gravestone. And the ghost story was told to me by two tourists who said they got to the museum too late to get in, but they saw a man inside the gate smoking a cigarette, and they called to him, but he walked away without saying anything. The next day, when they went into the museum, they saw a picture of Otto Leitner and swore it was the same man. Avilli Street in St. Augustine is the oldest platted street in the continental United States. It's the home of the Spanish Hospital Museum, the oldest house, the St. Augustine Historical Society. It's known as the Artist District. And the antique collectible place you see right there is no more. I mean, it's still standing, but it's owned by an investment company. But Bob and I used to go there a lot when the owners were still there, and they kept a ghost cam going 24 hours. A lot of people in St. Augustine do that. And they claim to see wispy figures, and they swear they saw, I forgot to mention, it was a jail in the 18th century. And they swear they saw drunken Spanish conquistadors reeling down the aisles. The love tree. This is one of 7 love trees in St. Augustine. An oak tree with a palm tree growing out of it in a lovely symbiotic relationship. And the one in front of the Bar Harbor Cheesecake Factory and next to the Talamato Cemetery is supposed to have special magical powers. The legend goes that 2 lovers planted the trees, the oak tree and the palm tree, and they died tragically. And the trees grew together intertwined. And so they say, if you kiss under the love tree, your love lasts forever. And there's many proposals and weddings there, but be careful who you kiss under the love tree, because they're not going anywhere after that. Okay, now we're going to go to Key West. And this was Bernadette, our ghost whisperer. And she wore her hair in honor of all of the fallen roosters and chickens in St. Augustine. She was passionate about the chickens and the roosters, and she wore her hair in honor of their combs. She claimed they were persecuted, although as far as I could tell, the whole town is overrun with chickens, and no one's bothering them. But she was adamant. And the chickens are in St. Augustine because in the old days they had cockfighting and it was outlawed. And they just let the chickens loose and they're there to this day. They're kind of aggressive, actually. Bernadette took us to the Key West Historic Cemetery where Sloppy Joe Russell is buried, Spanish-American war soldiers, cigar makers, Cuban revolutionaries. And I took these pictures in approximately the same location, a few minutes apart. It was dark when I took them, but when the pictures, I looked at the pictures later, there was that bolt of light, which according to ghost lore is supposed to be a manifestation of a spiritual being. Okay, this is the Fort Zachary Taylor State Park, and that's the latrine, which Bob made me take a picture of. And it's a four-holer. But the fort, named after Zachary Taylor, was not actually christened by him because on the 4th of July in 1850, he was busy consuming vast quantities of ice cream. And he ate so much that he got a terrible indigestion and he actually died July 9th. So he couldn't christen the fort. But the fort is the southernmost state park and fort in the United States. It has there's an actual beach outside, which is hard to find in Key West, and beautiful colored iguanas, although the locals hate them because they're kind of invasive. And, but it was known as the Gibraltar of the Gulf. And it was supposed to be an effort by the government to guard the shoreline of the southernmost part of the United States. And so the ghost story has to do, during the Civil War, the Union used it as a naval blockade. So the ghost story has to do with a soldier in a Civil War uniform standing outside the fort, gazing out to sea. He's kind of translucent, but he's been there a long time and they expect him to be there even longer. Okay, this is the story of a very peculiar doll named Robert. And he resides in the East Martello Fort in Key West, which, by the way, there are chickens outside, a lot of them. And Robert wears a sailor suit, and there's a weird dog in his lap with a protruding tongue and bulging eyes. And Robert belonged to a man named Eugene Robert Otto. And Gene would talk to the doll, and the doll would talk back to him. And when anything bad happened, he would say, well, Robert did it. And no one thought too much about this until one day his parents heard him screaming and crying and carrying on in his room. They went up to the door, it was locked. When they finally opened it, he was in the corner cowering, and Robert supposedly had ransacked the room. In spite of this, Robert was Gene's best friend throughout his life until, as a child, his parents took the doll away, and who can blame them? But when he got married, he got the doll back, and his bride banished it to the attic. Bernadette showed us the house where Robert used to live. And even though she did that, Robert appeared in windows throughout the house. And the weird thing about Robert now is that he freaks tourists out because if you take a picture of him, your camera's going to malfunction. That happened to us. We had a camera with fresh batteries in it, and when we took a picture of him, they burned out. So Bob had to go down the road and get new batteries, and we did manage to get that picture. But the docent there told us that he changes position all the time. Well, I'm almost ready to wrap up, But I just wanted to take a minute to talk about Lake County. I don't have a book about Lake County, but you do have a haunted place here. And it's the historic courthouse in Tavares on Main Street. It was built in the neoclassic revival architectural style. And it was the jail and headquarters of the notorious Willis McCall, a sheriff who reigned a rule of terror in Lake County for decades, and also persecuted the Groveland floor. There's no statue of McCall, but there is a plaque to the Groveland floor, persecuted by McCall, pardoned by DeSantis, and the subject of a great book by Gilbert King called Devil in the Grove. Now, the former people who worked in the courthouse said it's haunted. They said late at night, if they're working late, the elevators will go up and down by themselves, the water fountains will turn on by themselves, and some television people with EVPs, electronic voice phenomena, went up on the 5th floor and said there was definitely paranormal activity. But the scariest place is supposed to be the basement, because when you go down there, you often hear a slamming sound. Well, the gallows used to be right out in the parking lot, and they think that's the trap door slamming. Okay, so that's me and Bob with Henry Flagler in front of the old drugstore in St. Augustine. And we have a new book coming out in the fall called Secret St. Augustine. It's not just, there's some ghosts in there, but it's about a lot of little known things in St. Augustine. And we like to take pictures of our shadows for our author pictures. And I'll be happy to take your questions now, if you have any.